Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Solo ReacTalk. This morning, I'm going to be reacting to the Battle of May Island, down the rabbit hole made on the Frederick Knudsen YouTube channel and requested by Robert Fridays. Yes, if you guys want to check out my previous reaction to other Frederick Knudsen video content, remember that the reaction playlist card is going to be at the top right here for my down the rabbit hole reactions. If you want to check out the original video as well as Frederick Knudsen's YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. Okay, let's start with the Battle of May Island. 3, 2, 1, go.
For the length of their existence, submarines have inspired terror and paranoia. But for early submariners, the greatest threat wasn't from enemy vessels. The greatest threat was from their own.
Their own? What do you mean? Like their own fleet? Or the ship? Or the submarine, I mean.
For nearly 80 years, the depths of the waters off of the Isle of May harbored a secret. Only when divers stumbled upon a wreck was the court-martial for the Battle of May Island released, and only reluctantly, as it constituted one of the most embarrassing and absurd moments in the history of the Royal Navy. In the beginning of the 1900s, naval warfare was undergoing rapid changes. Only 50 years prior, European navies had begun abandoning wooden ships in favor of iron ones, driven by steam engines. And in the intervening decades, admirals theorized and drafted new designs. Their most crucial decision was how they would balance the three key aspects of a warship: speed, armor, and firepower.
Speed, armor, and firepower. Okay.
Increasing any of these would inevitably mean decreasing at least one of the others to accommodate it. However, in the absence of major fleet action, there was no way to properly test the particulars of this new form of naval combat, and so the admirals were forced to speculate about which factors would be most important in an engagement. And in the British Royal Navy, there were few as vocal or certain of their opinions as Sir John Fisher.
Sir John Fisher. Okay.
Fisher had long served as a respected member of the Navy, and by 1904, he was the obvious choice for First Sea Lord, the man.
Sea Lord. Interesting title. In British. Alright, First Sea Lord. That's nice. You're not an admiral, you know? You're not a commander. You're not a general. No, you are a Sea Lord. That's nice. Very nice title.
And who would coordinate the readiness of the entire fleet. Unlike his contemporaries, he had few qualms criticizing the Navy and its policies. Author N.S. Nash describes him so, quote, Fisher was not a nice chap in the conventional sense. He was a dynamic, tenacious, pugnacious, argumentative, and extrovert character with an absolutely iron determination to have his own way. He was a bully. He was also a sailor's officer and held views on discipline well ahead of his time. He utterly eschewed the rampant snobbery that beset the Victorian Navy. Fisher had one overriding deficiency. He believed, without equivocation, that he had a monopoly on wisdom.
Well, I guess he is the perfect pick for Sea Lord.
He did not. End quote. Before Fisher, the Royal Navy was an anachronistic combination of wooden-hulled, iron-hulled, and iron-plated ships.
Well, I guess it's time to modernize the fleet.
Upon his appointment as First Sea Lord, Fisher quickly set to work declaring over 150 ships in the Navy as too weak to fight and too slow to run away. Every wooden-hulled and iron-plated ship was retired, as well as some of the outdated iron-hulled ones. These would be replaced by ships of his own particular specifications. He had spent much of his career specializing in gunnery, and his beliefs followed accordingly. Of the three main aspects of naval vessels, speed, armor, and firepower, he valued speed and firepower first. He believed that if a ship could rapidly position itself and fire a powerful and accurate first volley, then thick armor would be unnecessary, as
yeah. Well, you have to account that, the British Empire spanned the entire world. They had colonies across the planet, and they needed vessels that could reach those destinations as soon as possible should anything happen in those colonies. So yeah, speed and power are necessary. However, since other European countries are also developing their own vessels that might have, firepower and armor, it might be a very difficult, situation for the British Royal Navy. And also you have to account for submarines. You have to account for aircraft that can carry bombs. They just need to know where to target the vessel, whether it's the port side or the starboard side or the stern's at the back, or the bow of the vessel. If they know where to target this ship with their torpedoes, the lightly armored British Royal Navy are going to have a problem. But I understand the rationale of, what's his name, Sir John Fisher, the Sea Lord. Speed is important, firepower is important, especially when you are an empire that spans the globe.
The enemy would never have a chance to fire back. Therefore, his ships would have high top speeds, and the focus he placed on gunnery during his time gave the British ships accurate and powerful gun turrets. However,
and it will also give shock and awe, kind of mental tactics. Your enemies will think twice, to try to attack the British Royal Navy. They have the firepower. They can just shoot at you once and you'll sink. Or they can just shoot across your bow, and you'll just see huge columns of water, and you'd imagine that could have been us. Those shells could have hit us and we would be dead. So it's also got that shock and awe kind of feeling to it. Don't mess with the British Royal Navy. We have big guns, we have fast ships. We will catch up to you and we will sink you. Yeah.
However, this came at a cost. The armor on his ships was so scant that they offered little to no protection from enemy guns. This design philosophy persisted after Fisher retired as First Sea Lord, as he continued to offer his counsel in naval affairs, resulting in ever larger ships with impressive gun batteries and high top speeds with extremely light armor. But beyond the modernization of the fleet, there was another issue that the British Royal Navy was reluctant to address: the progression of a naval technology known as the submarine. While there had already been instances of submersible craft, European navies were rapidly improving upon this concept, having realized their potential impact on naval warfare. While underwater, there was as yet no way to reliably detect a submarine, nor any way to reliably damage one, and so, effectively, a submerged submarine was both invisible and invincible.
Wow, there were no death charges during that time. There was no what is it called again? Sonic echolocation of some sort. Wow. Definitely the submarines, if they could perfect the technology to the point where weapons can be stored aboard the submarine and it can dive to deeper levels and move faster in the ocean, and there is a operation range that is increased for submarines. Definitely, this would be a death sentence for any British Royal Fleet that is, taking to the seas.
Periscope depth, they could launch torpedoes from relative safety, or they could surface to fire both torpedoes and deck-mounted guns from advantageous angles. Despite the inevitable dominance of the submarine, the British Royal Navy was notoriously inflexible, and during his 6-year tenure as First Sea Lord, Fisher had refused to allocate funds to the design of long-range submarines.
Big mistake. Big mistake, Sir John Fisher. But he's stubborn. He believes he's always right.
Choosing to focus on short-range craft, practical only for coastline defense, and purchasing many of the components and ships rather than constructing them. When World War I began in 1914, the British had few long-range submarines, while the Germans fielded 20 of them, and wielded the infrastructure to build many more. Fisher was recalled to serve as First Sea Lord once again late that year at the age of 73, and one of his chief goals was to correct for his lack of preparation by commissioning a new class of long-range submarine. But here, too, the rigidity of the Royal Navy would demand unfavorable compromise. The British and the Germans took opposing opinions on the role of submarines in naval warfare. The Germans believed that submarines worked best as autonomous, independent hunters, and at the outset of the war, they sent their submarines, or U-boats, into hostile waters to sink as many enemy warships as they could.
And it was effective. It was effective. Very, very effective for the Germans. Having submarines in a fleet formation, it's just, you're just begging to be a target. You are loud, you are active, and there'll be a chance for the enemies to spot you and to try to target you and destroy you. But if you're a lone wolf in the seas, no one can really detect you. No one can really, see your activities, whatever that it might be. Whether you are surfacing or you are diving, you're just one ship. You're just one submarine. But if it were multiple submarines in a fleet configuration, you're just a target waiting to be detected. So I think the Germans had it right. Lone wolves, have as many torpedoes as possible and whatever cannons you have on top of the submarine, and terrorize your opponents' supply vessels, naval vessels, and you have a potential of causing a lot of havoc and destruction.
This proved devastating. With no proper options to combat them, the British were entirely unable to prevent or even track German U-boat activity, and some of them inflicted casualties measured in the thousands on a single hunting expedition. Whenever a U-boat was spotted, it would simply crash dive, a maneuver that took, on average, only 30 seconds.
Now imagine it was a fleet of U-boats all huddled together, Even in those 20 seconds, you would have enough time to recognize that there's the enemy here, have a targeting solution on them and fire. But because it's just one U-boat, it's going to be very difficult for you to figure out where this U-boat is, even if you do see it, by the time you want to do something about it, it'll be gone. And the chances of you hitting it are very, very slim. So yeah.
The British became so desperate for some way to combat them that they ordered motorboats to patrol for enemy submarines at periscope depth and, upon discovering them, pull the boat alongside them and smash the glass of the periscope with a hammer.
Okay. I'm sure that worked, but it's funny.
Despite the U-boat's brutal attacks, the British Admiralty still believed that the most efficient method of fleet warfare was to engage in a single massive and decisive battle with their superior forces, and therefore, every effort should be made to prepare the Grand Fleet for such an engagement.
Man, that sounds like a tactic used for wooden built ships, you know. When you go to battle with a huge fleet and you engage your enemy with broadside, cannons and close quarter battle, yeah, that's an old tactic. The Germans have it right, you know. You have to decentralize everything. Everything has to scatter. You know, if everything is concentrated in one point, you're just a target waiting to be destroyed. So decentralize everything, scatter everything. It'll be very difficult for your enemies to figure out where you are. And you can take them out one by one if they are huddled together in a fleet like this.
Their long-range submarine would be designed accordingly. In theory, they would send flotillas of submarines alongside surface ships, and, upon sighting the enemy fleet with scout ships, they would dive and move into a flanking position, where they would strike with guns and torpedoes. The British admirals claimed that this would be simple to implement, and it therefore required little to no preparation. A pre-war mock battle, however, suggested the exact opposite, that executing this maneuver was so difficult and unintuitive that the submarines were more likely to surface into the hull of an Allied ship than inflict any casualties on the enemy. This was proven during the war in actual combat. The British surface ships mistook their submarines for German U-boats and attempted to ram them, while the British submarines fired torpedoes at their own fleet, only narrowly missing them.
Don't they have flags to identify that, oh, okay, no, this is our Allied forces? Or lights, or some sort of radio? They have nothing to distinguish who are enemy and who are friendlies. Oh.
Nevertheless, the Admiralty refused to change their position. To them, the only proper implementation of submarines was in fleet action. But this introduced a problem. According to British naval doctrine, fleets were to move at a pace of 21 knots.
Fleets to move 21 knots. Okay.
And despite the theorized power of submarines, the admirals were apparently unwilling to slow their fleets to include them. And so, Fisher approached the engineers with one demand in particular: that the new submarines have a maximum speed greater than 20 knots in order to keep pace with the other ships. Typically, submarines would use diesel engines while they were on the surface for greater speed, and then use batteries while under the water. However, the British had never developed the means to produce a diesel engine powerful enough to propel a submarine greater than 20 knots, and now that the Great War had begun, it was impossible to commission any from other nations that had such capabilities. The engineers, however, had a solution: steam engines. While the
Steam engines in water, surrounded by water? Okay.
diesel engine was a relatively new technology, steam engines had seen commercial use for nearly 200 years, and there was no question that a submarine with a steam engine could reach speeds well beyond Fisher's demands. The concept had been tested before in a small French submarine, which utilized retractable funnels for the smoke. However, while in enemy territory, a swell had bent her funnel, preventing it from retracting and allowing water from the waves and the rain to pour into the boiler. Immediately, the suggestion seemed outrageous.
I mean, if water goes into the boiler, isn't that a serious situation? Won't it explode? You know, and the occupants inside the submarine, won't they be the ones being affected by this sudden rush of... Sorry, alarm clock. What was I saying again? Oh yes, wouldn't the water, you know, rush into the boiler and then cause a explosion? And wouldn't that affect the people inside the submarine? Like, lethal? It would kill them probably. The submarine might also implode.
As author Don Everett put it, instinct and common sense had told Fisher that boilers, funnels, and submarines did not mix. Rather than entertain this idea, Fisher ordered the engineers to devise a way to increase the power of the diesel engines.
Okay.
But while this engine was being designed, the German U-boats were continuing their hunts in Allied waters. Scouting patrols were reporting false positives or identifying them incorrectly. Admirals and engineers were struggling to discover viable countermeasures, and the U-boats only continued to grow more aggressive and more numerous. Mariners grew paranoid, and at one point, rumors began to circulate about a U-boat that had been spotted traveling at 19 knots. In truth, there was no U-boat that could travel at 19 knots, but the Admiralty believed these reports all the same, First Sea Lord Fisher among them. During this time, in early 1915, Germany began its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, destroying ships indiscriminately, including neutral and merchant ships. Then, Fisher received word that the new diesel submarines would only be able to reach 19 knots, too slow to keep pace with the fleet. Believing he had no other option, Fisher returned to the idea of steam-powered submarines. And, reluctantly, he approved the first run of what would be known as the K-class.
The K-class, okay.
However, he demanded that they also be fitted with diesel engines as backups. The first...
It has a steam engine, a backup engine, which is a diesel, and then it possibly also has battery power. This is a ship. It's not a submarine. This thing is huge. This naval vessel is huge.
K-class submarine would be completed almost a year later in May of 1916. The best submarine captains in the fleet were recalled to command the K-class vessels, and they set about familiarizing themselves with this new craft. However, as they took to these ships, their excitement invariably turned to concern. The most obvious issue was their size. While most submarines were relatively small, the K-class was utterly massive.
Yeah. I mean, it has, what, 2 engines and a battery system. It has 2 engines in it. That's crazy.
Measuring at 103 meters in length, or 339 feet. This size was necessary to house its bulky steam engine, capable of propelling it to 24 knots, but this also meant that maneuvering was ponderous, and its turns were wide. While this was perhaps expected, the size introduced an unforeseen problem. When nosing down to dive, the deck would act as an extra hydroplane, pushing the submarine down much harder than intended. Nearly, if not every K-class submarine touched the bottom of the ocean with its nose at least once due to this issue.
Oh gosh, that must be terrifying for the people on board the submarine. You know, oh gosh.
Some lodging themselves in the silt while the stern hung helplessly in the air. This issue was addressed partially sometime later when bulbous bows were attached to the front of the vessel. But the K-class's maneuvering problems extended beyond its horizontal movement. Most submarines were capable of crash diving in approximately 30 seconds in case of danger. The K-class, comparatively, took on average over 5 minutes.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Nah. You guys are sitting targets. You are sitting targets, definitely. 5 minutes.
Not only to account for its size, but also to give it time to extinguish its furnaces and retract its smokestacks. The act of diving itself, however, was remarkably dangerous. Due to the brutal heat generated by the steam engine, numerous ventilation funnels were required throughout the ship. While open on the surface, it was common for water to splash into these funnels and spray painfully onto the engineers. In one instance, the ventilator fans sprayed the water so forcefully that it shattered the glass on the gauges. When diving, mushroom caps were supposed to shut these funnels, but these caps often failed to close, whether due to mechanical error, electrical error, human error, or even a piece of ocean debris lodging in the cap. In these cases, water would flood into the hull unimpeded. These were among the myriad other mechanical problems that were discovered and either had to be rectified or simply accepted. However, the longer the ships were docked, the more likely mechanical failure became, and since the Germans refused to engage the Grand Fleet in proper fleet battles, the K-class spent the majority of their time waiting static at port.
You know what? That's better, because to me it sounds like these K-class submarines were a death trap. Really, it's a death trap. It takes you 5 minutes to submerge your submarine. I'm telling you, the U-boats are going to have a field day with you guys. They're going to have a field day.
While these problems alone made fielding the K-class a questionable decision, further design flaws became evident on rough seas. One of the largest problems was entirely foreseen, yet went unprevented. When the swells became large enough, water would pour into the funnels for the steam engines, putting out the furnaces and sometimes causing blowbacks so ferocious that the engineers were burnt to death.
That's what I'm worried about. That's what I'm worried about with steam engines in a submarine. Like, what are you people thinking?
This, however, was assuming that the furnaces would stay lit. The K-class submarine utilized a clever method of storing oil for the burners. As oil was siphoned from the tanks, seawater would be let in to fill them, helping to keep the ship at the proper buoyancy. In calm waters, the oil would float on top of the water and work as intended, but in rough seas, these tanks would sometimes be shaken enough to temporarily mix the oil and water, extinguishing the furnaces. On calm seas, if the oil pump wasn't turned off before a dive, then it could flood the boiler room with oil and catch fire, burning the equipment and the people inside, as it did at least once. The oil tanks themselves were embedded directly into the hull, and the top of the tank served also as the floor of the mess hall, but these panels were designed loose enough so that, when under the water and subjected to pressure, black oil would seep up between the seams in the panels, making the floor slick. Even when the ship was running well, working on it was a miserable experience.
You can imagine. And the submarines of those times probably were also extremely cramped. So it's slippery, it's wet on the floor, you're in a cramped environment, a very dreary environment. You have to make sure that the engines are working optimally. You have to also make sure that there isn't going to be any sort of catastrophe with the steam engine. You are diving, you hit a ground sometimes, or other systems are not working properly because there's water rushing into the hull of the ship. This vessel is a death trap. It's a death trap. And Sir John Fisher is not the one suffering here. He is not the one suffering on board these submarines. So that's why he still continues to think that, this is the way things should be done in terms of creating a submarine doctrine centered around a fleet battle formation. It's because I don't even think he's actually stepped foot into one of these submarines. I don't think he's actually dived with one of these submarines. If he had, then he would realize how dangerous these things are.
Furnaces were placed in the center of the ship, and so the only cooler section was the conning tower. But there, living conditions were scarcely better. The K-class was designed to sit high in the water, and when the ship rocked, even those with strong stomachs grew seasick while swaying high in the tower due to its irregular rhythm. Getting up to the conning tower, however, posed its own danger, as when water splashed down onto the control panels, it would ground them and cause the latter to shock anyone who touched it. Typically, to escape the uncomfortable accommodations of submarines, crews would be permitted to rest and live on depot ships while at port, but for those aboard the K-class, no such accommodations were made, as the K-class was designated a self-contained warship.
Self-contained? Yeah, for death.
This compounded with the reputation of the K-class for killing its crews, and in response to this stress, the men assigned to these ships regularly became violent with one another, and most turned to alcohol. What's more, the submariners were usually listless and bored, as the vast majority of their time was spent moored. They would occasionally scout for U-boats off of the coast of the British Isles, but in only one instance did a K-class engage an enemy submarine, where she managed to strike her target with a dud torpedo.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh, and this has only happened once. It's because the German U-boats are, I would say almost majority of the time, they're under the water. You know, they're submerged. They don't have time to be sailing on the surface like they're a ship, like the K-class.
Despite all of its shortcomings and its litany of failures, the Admiralty was still intent on seeing the K-class submarines used to their fullest potential, and the price of this self-assuredness would be paid not by those in command, but by those serving aboard the vessels themselves.
Exactly.
On the evening of January 31st, 1918, a fleet of British ships left the port of Rosyth on the east coast of Britain. That night's goal was simple. The force was to travel through the Firth of Forth into the North Sea. Then, when they had passed north of the Isle of May, they were to change direction and proceed to a predetermined point where they would meet with another force traveling from Scapa Flow to participate in an exercise. Among these ships were 9 K-class submarines.
9 K-class.
And by now, each sailor aboard them had come to fear their vessel as much as any enemy's, perhaps more. All of the sailors were nervous. Earlier that afternoon, a pilot in a scout plane had spotted a submarine, but before he could approach, the submarine performed a crash dive and disappeared. Out in the open water, the fleet would be a vulnerable target for a German U-boat, and so extra precautions would be necessary. But there was another cause for the sailors' concern. Of the K-class submarines joining the fleet, one of them was of particular note, K-22. By now, many of the sailors knew that K-22 was not her original designation. She had formerly been known by the particularly unlucky name K-13. What's more, almost a year prior to the day, K-13 had catastrophically failed her trial run and foundered, killing nearly half of her crew. Those who survived were carved out of the hull only barely before they suffocated, and the ship was refitted and rechristened as K-22. According to naval superstition, a rechristened ship can only be unluckier than it once was. As if to make matters worse, the ship was assigned to the 13th Submarine Flotilla. To the crew, a ship rechristened from K-13 traveling with the 13th Submarine Flotilla on the the anniversary of her fatal accident felt like tempting fate. The force from Rosyth was divided into 5 groups traveling in one long single-file line stretching for over 15 nautical miles, with each group leaving approximately 15 minutes after the one ahead of it. Out ahead, the flagship Courageous led the way.
And Courageous looks like a destroyer or a battleship. No, not a battleship, but yeah, destroyer. Okay.
On her own. Close behind was the 13th Submarine Flotilla, led by the Marksman-class flotilla leader Ethereal, which was to command and coordinate the 5 K-class submarines behind her: K-11, K-17, K-14, K-12, and finally, the rechristened K-22.
Okay.
Behind them, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron followed, consisting of 4 large cruisers: the Australia,
okay, Inflexible, huh. All right. Indomitable, New Zealand, huh. And Australia. Okay.
the New Zealand, the Indomitable, and the Inflexible. These ships were flanked by smaller destroyers on either side in loose formation. Destroyers typically sat much higher in the water than the other larger surface ships, making them safer from enemy torpedo fire, and so they were often used to screen for enemy U-boats and act as an initial defensive line for cruisers and battleships. Following the cruisers was the 12th Submarine Flotilla, led by the scout cruiser Fearless.
Fearless. Should say here it's K-class.
Which had been retrofitted into a submarine tender for the 4 K-class submarines under her command: K4, K3,
K4, K3,
K6, and K7.
K6 and K7.
The Fearless was of particular note due to her dazzle camouflage, an experiment designed to make it more difficult for enemy ships to gauge her distance. Finally, there were 3 massive battleships from
Wow. Valiant. Warspite. And Barham.
the 5th Battle Squadron, the Barham, the Warspite, and the Valiant, with yet more screening destroyers assigned to their defense. In total, besides the destroyers, there were 19 ships leaving the port of Rosyth that evening as the sun set. In the dark, it would be impossible for each ship to directly follow the one ahead of it without assistance, and so each shone a blue stern light behind it as they left. These lights were only shown at half luminosity and shuttered so that they could only be seen within a narrow angle behind the ship, meaning that it would be easy to lose sight of this light. The difficulty was heightened as a mist settled onto the waters around May Island, reducing visibility.
There's a mist. The light on the stern is barely be seen, and you're moving in a fleet formation. like in a straight line. I don't know how long again, 15 nautical miles, right? This is a recipe for disaster. This is a recipe for disaster.
Reacting to the U-boat sighting earlier that day, the commander of the force had ordered all ships to increase speed to 21 knots when entering the open ocean in order to pass through the threatened area as quickly as possible. But shortly after passing the Isle of May, the submarine directly behind the Ethereal, K-11, noticed two small ships in the mist ahead of it. This was curious, as the Ethereal had given no warning, and nobody had been informed of any other ships scheduled to enter the waters around the island. To the captain of K-11, it was as if they had materialized out of the mist. Despite the poor visibility and the poor maneuverability of the submarine, K-11 was able to make a wide turn to avoid the vessels easily. K-17, close behind it, noticed the maneuver and made the same wide turn to avoid an impact. K-14, however, hesitated, uncertain of why they were making an unscheduled change of course, and the captain ordered to slow the ship from 19 knots to 13 in case of an obstacle. Suddenly, he saw the two ships in the mist and ordered a hard turn to port. The helm responded, and K-14 swung clear of the ships, but as the helmsman was rotating the wheel, it jammed.
At a time like this, it jams? Oh my gosh. K-12 and K-22 are still on their way. You guys better rectify that situation as soon as possible.
Submarine's current trajectory would take her well clear of the two unknown vessels, but the helmsman was no longer in control of the rudder, and the ship was stuck turning left. The captain turned on the navigation lights and called to halt the ship as the helmsman fruitlessly attempted to free the wheel. He pushed as hard as he could, but no matter how much pressure he applied, the wheel would not move beyond 3 inches in either direction, and all the while, the ship coasted through the water, the steam engine fighting against the massive momentum of the submarine. At last, K-14 came to a stop. Time was crucial, as the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron was sure to be close behind, and if K-14 did not move, they ran the risk of being rammed by one of their number. More immediately, however, was the fear of the submarine just behind them, K-12, of inadvertently hitting them. Fortunately, K-12 also illuminated her navigation lights, and it was obvious that she would pass well clear of them. Assuming that K-22 would be following K-12, the captain busied himself with how he would clear K-14 of the battlecruisers closing on their position.
This is a problem. Assumptions. You know, you think that the captain of K-22 is going to understand the situation and just continue to follow K-14. Or no, not K-14, K-12. But you're not really sure about that. There's no surety. I don't know why isn't there any sort of radio communication, some sort of emergency communication, just to state that, you know, K-14 has a problem. We are not going to be able to participate in the fleet formation. Something, say something, do something. Instead of just assuming that the captain of K-22 is going to understand that it needs to continue to follow K-12. Oh well.
5 minutes later, as he ordered the ship ahead, the helm came free and the rudder would turn again, apparently with full control. The captain belayed his previous order and quickly decided that he would attempt to fall back in line with the rest of the submarines in the flotilla.
Okay, wait for K-22 to pass, and then you can get in behind K-22. Don't cut the line. Don't cut the line.
However, one of his assumptions had proven wrong. The unlucky K-22 had been the last submarine in the line, but 5 minutes prior, their lookout had lost sight of K-12 and her stern light. K-22 had continued ahead at 19 knots in order to rediscover K-12, but had drifted far to port, and now she was on a direct course to ram K-14.
Oh my gosh.
Through the mist, K-22 spotted the red navigation light of K-14, and the captain ordered a hard turn to port. But the submarine was far too heavy and clumsy to make such a drastic turn. The bow of K-22 sliced into the nose of K-14, breaching the crew compartment where two submariners were resting. Freezing water rushed into the submarine and caught these two men unaware, and they were quickly sucked out into the sea and drowned as a chunk of the bow from K-14 tore free and sank. Aboard K-22, the torpedo room was breached and water began rushing into it, but the crew was able to shut the watertight door and prevent the submarine from flooding. The same occurred aboard K-14. Everyone aboard each ship was confused. The captain of K-14 was baffled as to how he had been hit when his navigation lights made him so obvious in the water, while the captain of K-22 erroneously believed that he had hit K-12, the ship he was supposed to be following. In reality, K-12 had caught up with the ship ahead of it, mistaking K-17 for K-14, and was now following the undamaged members of the 13th Submarine Flotilla out into the North Sea, none of them aware of the collision. It was quickly established that the bow of K-22 was now lodged deep into K-14, but neither ship was in immediate danger of sinking.
Okay, but then there's still other battle groups that are coming in. I think you should start flickering your navigational lights on the stern, just to alert others that, hey, we have a problem. Don't come near us, or something. Some sort of Morse code. Do something. Because the other battle groups are coming in. Oh gosh.
Knowing that the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron was on its way, a submariner exited the top of K-14 and began firing flares into the air in order to warn off any other ships, while another crew member requested assistance in Morse code with a lantern.
Good, good.
And aboard K-22, the radio operator coded a message to the Ethereal to inform them of the collision.
So you guys do have radio.
However, this message incorrectly stated that they had hit K-12, not K-14, and even then, it would take time for the message to be decoded. Before anything else could be done, the two ships would have to extricate K-22 from the hull of K-14. To this end, K-22 set her engines in reverse, and the ship carefully slid her nose out of the hull of K-14 with surprising ease.
Yeah, but you're going too far now. You're going too far away.
Soon, K-22 was facing directly eastward. But this had taken time, and soon after K-22 had settled in the water again, the massive Australia, leading the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, passed K-22 on the port side, and close behind her were the New Zealand and the Indomitable. These 3 battlecruisers had fortunately chosen courses that took them around the submarines, only sloshing the barely buoyant ships in the water. But unbeknownst to anyone else, the final ship in the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, the Inflexible, had some time prior lost sight of the ship ahead of it in the mist and had drifted significantly off course. Hoping to gain on them again, the captain ordered the speed increased, but only a few moments after he gave the order, he saw the starboard side of K-22, motionless and damaged in the water. Desperately, he gave the order to turn to starboard. The turn made the angle shallower, but it was far too late to prevent an impact. The bow of the Inflexible scraped along the starboard side of K-22, shearing off the external ballasts and the oil tanks before steaming past. Enraged, the captain of K-22 climbed out of the conning tower, shook his fist, and shouted, "What the hell are you doing?"
What the hell are you guys doing? What the hell are you doing, Captain of K-22?
Ignoring the question, the Inflexible continued on insouciantly and disappeared into the mist.
It's not like they could hear you anyways.
It quickly became clear that none of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron would be stopping to assist or assess the damage, leaving the 2 submarines to fend for themselves for the time being. In order to stay buoyant, K-22 emptied fuel and water from its tanks, coating the surface of the sea in a thin oil. Meanwhile, the Ethereal had finally managed to decode the distress call sent from K-22. At some point while relaying the message, someone had made a serious error, and it wasn't until almost 30 minutes later that the captain of the Ethereal learned of the first collision, after they had traveled 20 nautical miles away from the wreck. Acting quickly, the Ethereal made the decision to turn around and offer assistance.
Can you first inform the other battle groups that are behind you that we are turning, we're going back to K-22 and K-14. Yeah, please inform everybody. Tell everybody that there's a problem, we're turning back. All the other ships, maybe just stay where you are in your positions. Don't move forward. Something like that.
The captain was aware that this would potentially take the 13th submarine flotilla on a direct course towards the other ships exiting the Firth of Forth, and so he decided to make an extremely wide turn to starboard, surmising that if the turn was wide enough, they would pass the other ships far to the south. To reduce confusion, the Ethereal ordered the submarines to turn off their navigation lights, and out of an abundance of caution, the captain ordered a message sent to the other ships to inform them of this maneuver.
Okay.
However, the orders given to each group left an ambiguity. While they were to turn upon passing the Isle of May, no specific location was designated to begin this maneuver, and so each group turned at slightly different points, meaning that they were all now heading along slightly different tracks.
Oh my gosh.
And now, the 13th Submarine Flotilla was headed directly towards the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron. Ideally, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron would know to look for them, but despite the Ethereal's prudence, the battlecruisers were entirely unaware of the approach of the flotilla. The coding officer had been handed the message, but after he had finished coding it, he was given an addendum, and he was forced to code this as well. While he was coding this message, the cipher officer approached him and told him that the message should be sent in cipher, not code, and took both messages away to the bridge. For 30 minutes, the 13th Submarine Flotilla and the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron steamed towards each other as the messages aboard the Ethereal were shuffled, amended, recoded, and reciphered. The warning was no closer to being transmitted by the time they were upon one another.
And the navigational lights have also been switched off. Ugh.
The Australia, the New Zealand, and the Indomitable were all on a collision course towards the Ethereal. The Inflexible, which had ripped the ballast and fuel tanks off of K-22, was nowhere to be found. The mist gave the Ethereal little time for evasive maneuvers. She desperately turned to starboard to avoid the line of battlecruisers, and behind her, K-11 followed. The Australia, believing that the danger had passed, carried on her course. But at the last second, they saw that two more submarines, K-17 and K-12, were headed towards them. Any maneuver that the Australia made, however, would only put the submarines into further danger, as her stern would swing wide to hit the last submarine. Therefore, it was left to the clumsy K-class submarines to evade the Australia on their own.
Oh gosh.
Each of them turned hard to starboard to follow the Ethereal and her maneuver. K-17 was able to make her turn just in time, but K-12 drew right up alongside the cruiser. With only feet to spare, K-12 passed clear of the Australia.
Oh.
However, this maneuver placed the remainder of the 13th Submarine Flotilla into further danger. While the battlecruisers had been evaded, there was still the matter of the screening destroyers concealed in the mist. Precisely how many there were, not even all of the captains knew. The Ethereal's turn had unknowingly placed her on a collision course directly with the destroyer, and seeing her with only seconds to spare, the Ethereal swung back to starboard to avoid her, then corrected her course to carry her southwest once again to take her out of the swarm of destroyers. As she did so, another screening destroyer placed herself in the way of the Ethereal, and again, the captain ordered a hard turn to starboard.
Now imagine all the other K-class submarines that are trying to follow the Ethereal as it keeps zigzagging left and right trying to avoid destroyers. Oh my god, this is chaos.
The angle and the speed seemed far too much this time for those above deck, and they braced for impact. But miraculously, the Ethereal steered out of the way, and she once again continued leading the 13th submarine flotilla through the mist.
I mean, imagine there were German U-boats, in this situation, and they just saw their enemies doing this. Like, what do? Do you just wait for them to reorganize themselves after they have crashed into each other, or do you take them out while they're still in this chaotic mess? Yeah.
At last, they had cleared the 2nd battlecruiser squadron and its destroyers. But the 13th submarine flotilla was far from safe. The 12th submarine flotilla had made its turn much earlier than the other groups, and now the two flotillas were traveling at a shallow angle towards each other, the 12th traveling east and the 13th traveling southwest. The captain of the Ethereal believed that the 12th submarine flotilla would be aware of their presence, but the message had still not been delivered, meaning that the Fearless didn't know to look for the Ethereal or her submarines. As they approached, both submarine leaders saw that the two lines of ships would cross paths, but here the mist was lighter, and they were able to see one another with generous time to make a proper maneuver. It was clear that the Ethereal would easily pass the Fearless, but the present course could not be maintained if the K-class submarines were to avoid the Fearless and each other. Movement among naval vessels is governed by a set of rules, and one of these rules is that smaller ships are to turn to make way for larger ones, and between the Fearless and the K-class, the Fearless was the larger. Therefore, the captain of the Fearless ordered to maintain the present course. According to the rules of the sea, the K-class submarines would have to turn to starboard to make way for the Fearless and fall back in line with the Ethereal soon after. Given that there were no screening destroyers for the flotillas, this theoretically wouldn't pose a problem. However, the K-class submarines had no intention of changing course.
Why? Why?
K-11, the submarine directly behind the Ethereal, passed in front of the Fearless, closer than was comfortable. The Fearless, however, continued onward.
No, full stop. Full stop and start reversing. Inform your who's with the Fearless? Yes, inform your K-class submarines to also make a full stop and reverse. And then also inform the other battleship formations to make a full stop. Wait, wait. There are ships here that are just crossing our line, and they're just coming too close. Just allow, the Ethereal and its K-class submarines just to pass by, and then you guys can proceed forward. Stop. Just stop.
Now, K-17 was approaching. The Fearless waited to see K-17 turn as the two drew close, refusing to alter her heading out of fear of causing even further problems by encroaching on the submarine's responsibility. The Fearless waited until a collision became inevitable. In an effort to make the angle shallower, the Fearless began to turn, but it was far too late. As sirens blared, the bow of the Fearless struck the side of K-17 and lodged into her, dragging her forward with her massive momentum. Pulled by the water, K-17 rolled off to the port side of the Fearless and tore free. For the moment, the Fearless appeared to still be buoyant, but it was immediately obvious that K-17 was hopelessly damaged. While the lurch was brutal for both ships, nobody was fatally injured, and the 56 men aboard K-17 began clambering to the top deck as the boats from the Fearless were lowered to ferry the submariners to safety. To warn her attendant submarines, the Fearless began blasting a signal over the foghorn, indicating that the ship was coming to a stop.
That's something that should have been done a while ago, but yeah.
Behind it, K4 heard the warning alarm and set her engines into full reverse, bringing her to a halt just barely in time before hitting the Fearless. Meanwhile, K-12 from the 13th Submarine Flotilla was approaching the damaged ships at a rapid pace. She made a sharp turn to starboard to avoid the Fearless and K-17, which now rested in her way, and she was just barely able to clear both damaged ships and careen past the 12th Submarine Flotilla. Behind K-4, K-3 was closing distance. The captain was called to the bridge during his dinner, but when he arrived, he was uncertain.
How can you have dinner in a battle fleet operation? How can you have dinner at this? Oh my God. No, you're not supposed to be having any food at this point in time. When you are, operating on a mission right here, with the battle fleet.
Certain of what precisely was happening ahead of him, with the cacophony of sirens and mess of lights. He ordered the engines to half steam as he attempted to evaluate the situation.
Half steam, full stop, full stop.
But as K-3 neared the ships, he recognized that he was on a collision course with K-4, and what's more, he would not be able to stop his massive submarine in time with the distance remaining. The helm oversteered K-3 to port, swinging the whole ship and trying to push her momentum to the port side of K-4.
But look where it's heading. It's heading for the boats that are trying to rescue the sailors from the which one was K-17.
Now, however, the stern of the submarine was on track to hit K-4. Deftly, the helm turned K-3 back to starboard, swinging the stern out of the way just barely in time. Ordering the engines astern full, the submarine slowly began drifting to a stop just to the port side of the heavily damaged Fearless. In the meantime, K-6 turned slightly starboard to pull safely clear of K-12, which was still attempting to run alongside the 12th Submarine Flotilla. K-12 then circled back to inspect the damage and offer assistance, stopping off of the port bow of K-3. Now, the Fearless, K-4, K-12, K-3, and the sinking K-17 were all clustered together in the waters off of the Isle of May, with sirens blaring and lights shining bright in the mist like beacons. If the U-boat appeared now, there was no telling how many British sailors would be slaughtered. Attention was now turned to the sinking submarine. While the watertight doors of K-17 had been closed to prevent further flooding, she had taken on far too much seawater and would inevitably sink. The water continued to rise around the 56 evacuees who jumped into the icy ocean, contaminated with black oil from K-17. The lower bow of the Fearless was now only a gaping hole, having been crushed, crumpled, and torn by the impact with K-17, but the watertight doors had been sealed, and she was apparently able to remain buoyant for the time being. Likely attempting to remove itself from the tangle of ships, K-4 turned 90 degrees starboard.
What are you doing? What are you doing? You were not given orders to do that.
Behind this chaos, K-6 was attempting to catch up to the ship ahead of it. During K-3's desperate turn and her own turn to avoid K-12, K-6 had lost sight of K-3's stern light, but now, seeing a light through the mist, the captain ordered the helmsman to follow it, assuming that he had rediscovered K-3. However,
Why are you doing this, Captain of K-4? What are you doing? You should have stayed in your position until you were given orders otherwise. What are you doing?
as he approached, he ascertained that it was not the stern light of K3. It was the starboard light of K4, floating motionless in the water. By the time K6 made this realization, there was no time for any action. The bow of K6 rammed straight into the side of K4, nearly shearing her in half. Immediately, K4 began to sink, dragging K6 down into the ocean with her. Just behind K6 was K7, which was still traveling at significant speed. The captain had a habit of keeping his ship farther behind the ship ahead of it than ordered, especially aboard the unmaneuverable K-class that he was newly captaining. As K7 moved through the mist to keep pace with K6, the captain suddenly realized that the ship ahead was completely and inexplicably stationary. He ordered the engines full astern, but it was obvious that this wouldn't be enough to bring her to a stop in time. The helm pulled the nose of K7 to port, with just enough space for the ship to slide alongside K6. As she did so, the bottom of the ship struck the sinking K4, but K4 was sinking so rapidly that she only scraped the top.
Oh my gosh.
The captain of K6 ordered the engines full astern in a desperate attempt to pry herself free, and the two halves of K4 tore apart, abruptly releasing K6, which bobbed back up to the surface. Immediately, the crew of K6 trained their lights ahead, looking for survivors, but no movement could be found on the still water. There had been no time for anyone to escape. In the meantime, many of the 56 men of K-17 were struggling to keep their heads above water as the cold stole their strength and they inadvertently gulped down the black oil, while a few still stood on the casing of their sinking submarine. By this point, the boats from the Fearless had all been deployed and were busying themselves finding submariners in the water to pull to warmth and safety. But behind this cluster of ships, there was still one final group leaving the Firth of Forth.
The battleships.
The 5th Battle Squadron, with its 3 battleships and its myriad screening destroyers. They had passed well south of the first collision between K-14 and K-22, but even after all this time, only the first warning about the first collision had been transmitted, useless by this point, leaving the massive battleships entirely unaware that the 13th Submarine Flotilla had even reversed course, and now they were bearing down on the remaining ships of the 2 flotillas at a speed of 21 knots.
My gosh, why didn't they just stop? you know, after the first crash, they should have all just stopped. All vessels, stop where you are. Let's confirm what's happening. And if we can rectify the situation, and then one by one we reorganize and reorder ourselves into a fleet, and we move in unison once again. But everybody is just doing their own thing, and then all of a sudden, surprise, surprise, they start crashing into each other.
First, the Barham approached, and it appeared that she would scrape along the port side of K3, but by incredible luck, she managed to squeeze between K3 and K12, avoiding not only the survivors of K17, but all of the ships tangled among one another. But this was not the case for the screening destroyers. Ignorant of the survivors in the water, they chose tracks around the Fearless.
They're gonna run over them. They're going to just demolish and just go right through them all.
And the sinking submarine. The rescue boats from the Fearless scattered and dodged out of the way as the destroyers carved their paths straight through the survivors. As the first destroyer passed, she slammed into the men, concussing and battering many of them, while others were sucked into the propellers and torn into pieces. The wash of the Barham swept over the sailors still standing on K-17, pushing them into the water and directly into the path of the remaining destroyers. Following close behind the Barham was the Warspite, which threaded between the ships in exactly the same way that the Barham had, but along with her came further screening destroyers, who crushed yet more survivors, and finally, the Valiant passed between them with the last group of destroyers. All 3 battleships have been traveling so precisely that they managed to weave their ships between the submarines without even touching their hulls. The fortune of the battleships was undercut by the deadly courses of the destroyers. As they found new paths, each one struck, drowned, and dismembered even more submariners. This continued until the entire 5th Battle Squadron had passed. After they did, the sailors aboard the Fearless and the other K-class submarines searched for men in the oily, bloody water, but of the 56 who had abandoned K-17, only 10 could be found, one of whom was gravely wounded. After bringing him aboard the Fearless, this wounded man died as well, leaving only 9. At
Wow.
last, the waters were clear and the ships could take inventory. The Fearless herself had been horrifically damaged, but it was clear that she was in no danger of sinking despite the gaping hole in the foresection, and so she began to limp back to Rosyth alongside the remaining K-class submarines. Back at the initial collision, K-14 and K-22 were receiving assistance from some of the screening destroyers, and one of them began towing K-14 back to harbor. K-22, on the other hand, was able to travel back on her own power, but her speed was limited by the pressure placed on the door exposed to the water in the foresection. The other ships, still scheduled to meet with the force from Scapa Flow, continued onward into the North Sea, leaving the carnage of the submarine flotillas behind them. After an hour and 15 minutes, the Battle of May Island was finished.
The Battle of May Island.
Immediately upon the return of the damaged ships, the admirals began communicating, desperate to discover what precisely had happened. Many of the details were muddled and contradictory.
What had happened is that you guys don't know when to stop. You guys don't know when to stop. When there's traffic ahead, you don't just plow yourself through, the traffic to get to your destination. You're going to kill yourself. You're going to kill other people. You stop. Everybody must stop until we're able to understand what's happening, and then you deal with that situation, and then you continue on with the traffic. You don't just plow yourself through it and then you go to your own directions whenever you want to. Trying to beat the traffic, trying to avoid the traffic in some sort of way. You're just going to cause more problems. Treat this like you would treat a freeway. But I don't think many of these sailors during that time actually drove cars or had freeways in Britain of any kind of stature that we have nowadays. But yeah, really, the rules of the road must also apply in the sea. It must also apply in the sea. When there's an accident up ahead, you just stop. You just slow down, you stop. You don't try to find a shortcut. You don't try to get out of the road because you're afraid something might happen. No, you're just going to cause more chaos, more confusion, and more accidents.
Only a few things could be discerned for certain. Of the 9 K-class submarines that had left the Firth of Forth that night, 2 had sunk and 3 had been damaged to varying degrees, a casualty rate of over 50%. The Fearless had suffered crippling damage to her hull, while the Inflexible had lived up to her name and escaped with only scrapes. From the initial impact between K-14 and K-22, 2 men had drowned when water flooded into the living quarters. When K-6 had bisected K-4, every one of the 55 men aboard went down with the ship. And of the 56 who escaped from K-17, 47 of them had been smashed and shredded by the screening destroyers. No survivors were discovered after the event, and the vast majority of the corpses were lost at sea. The final death toll for the Battle of May Island was 104.
And they all come from K-class vessels. They all come from K-class vessels.
The admirals agreed. This matter had to be resolved both quickly and discreetly. After only 4 days, the court-martial began to determine who and what precisely was at fault. Despite the overwhelming complexity of the Battle of May Island and the myriad of conflicting reports, a basic timeline of what occurred could be ascertained, though the specific routes of certain ships remained in dispute. In particular, the inciting incident for the entire event was confounding. First, what were the two boats that had found themselves in the path of the 13th submarine flotilla, floating in the mist? Nobody with the force leaving Rosyth was informed about other ships scheduled to be in the water, and they were far too small to be enemy vessels. The immediate suspicion was that they were minesweepers, but when the man coordinating the ships at the Isle of May was brought to testify, his statements didn't align with the experiences of the 13th submarine flotilla.
And also, the Ethereal did not detect these two boats, right? Maybe I'm wrong about that. But it was the K-class submarines that detected these two boats, and they're the ones who were taking, maneuvers. But the Ethereal did not see anything.
He confirmed that, while there were small ships out sweeping for mines at the time, they theoretically wouldn't have crossed paths with the ships from Rosyth. Even more mysterious, however, was the mechanical failure experienced by K-14, namely, the jamming of her helm. While the K-class was prone to sometimes extreme issues related to their construction and maintenance, there had never been a catalogued incident with the helm jamming, and nobody serving aboard the K-class ever made mention of such an incident. A thorough
Wow, there's a first time for everything. There's a first time for everything with this K-class submarine.
Investigation of every mechanism from the helm to the rudder was performed, and yet, every single test came back with the same result. As things were, no cause could be found for the jam, and it could not be replicated. In the end, while a few of the officers were reprimanded, this had little to no effect on their careers, and the reason seemed clear. The event had been so embarrassing for the British Royal Navy that the Admiralty was more interested in hiding it than remedying it. No memorial was to be constructed, and no record was to be made public.
How is this possible? How is this possible? What about accountability to the government? To the portfolio that is responsible for the military, to the legislative arm of the government. How are they able to contain 104 lives and the destruction of 2 vessels and the damage of 4 or 5 vessels? How are they able to conceal such important information from the government? And why would the government allow for the military to classify this? Maybe they also don't want to have this sort of embarrassment on their hands.
To the submariners who partook in the Battle of May Island, the moral was clear. The K-class was far too awkward and unreliable, communication technology was too rudimentary to properly coordinate with the fleet, and fleet submarines were more of a danger to their own ships than to any enemy. But to the admirals, the problem lay not with the K-class, nor with the concept of fleet submarines, only in their implementation. The performance of these large submarines after the war, however, did not bear out the expectations of the admirals. They never were to encounter the enemy beyond the one fruitless exchange of fire, and after a formal declaration of peace between the belligerents in the Great War, the K-class were assigned to posts around the Atlantic.
The K-class need to be scrapped. They need to be scrapped. And new submarines need to be built on the ethos, or should I say the way the Germans have built their U-boats. And you guys need to start doing something like that instead of forcing this behemoth of a ship that's a death trap to continue serving the British Royal Navy. They need to be scrapped.
There, however, they continued to suffer mechanical faults, and dozens of the Grand Fleet's best mariners drowned as K-class continued to sink. Even still, the admirals were keen to make use of this submarine that was meant to be one of the great achievements of the Royal Navy. As such, a few of the K-class were retrofitted to have massive 12-inch guns mounted onto the deck, recategorizing them as the M-class. This
M-class. Okay.
This extra gun, however, made the already clumsy ships even more unwieldy. On December 12, 1925, M1 dove during an exercise and simply never resurfaced, drowning all 60 men aboard. After so many deaths due to the inadequacy of the submarines, the Royal Navy was finally forced to retire the remaining K-class, sending the majority of them in for scrap. The M-class, however, were retrofitted for new purposes. M2 was outfitted with a hangar to launch a single biplane with folding wings, while
Guys, do you want to be a submarine, or do you want to be a battleship, or do you want to be an aircraft carrier? What is this? What is this? Hey.
M3 was given a mine layer. But these alterations couldn't solve the extant issues with the hull.
Clearly, the British Royal Navy had a lot of money. They had a lot of resources. They had the backing of the government. You know, there was no oversight. They could play around and do whatever they wanted. And that's the result. This is the result. The M-class being this amalgamation of different, you know, structural assets on one ship. It's supposed to be a submarine, but they've just muddled that up with so many other options and placements on it, and just I don't know what that is. How am I supposed to utilize that effectively on the battlefield, or in the seas, I should say? You know, no, you can't be a jack of all trades. It has to be proficient in one responsibility, and that is to submerge, that is to stay submerged, that is to shoot torpedoes, and that is to stay, in incognito from the enemy. That's the main purpose of a submarine, not all these other things that you're showing us. Like, what is this? Oh, wow.
One day, while out at sea, M2 seemed to disappear entirely. Only hours later, a man aboard a ship who had seen M2 that morning casually asked if it was normal for submarines to dive backwards.
Backwards?
He was told that it was not. It took 8 days for the search teams to discover M2 in over 100 feet of water. Her crew had all suffocated in the time it took the salvage crews to find her. It was decided that M3 would not be given the chance to drown her crew as well, and she was scrapped for her metal. The last of the K-class hulls had finally disappeared, and with them, the dream of the fleet submarine. It would be decades until the creation of another submarine that rivaled the size of the K-class, and this time, when they did, they were running under nuclear power, and their implementation would not even slightly resemble that of the K-class.
Whoa, so during World War II, there weren't any submarines. They kind of skipped that part there. The British Royal Navy. Okay.
Even after the war, as the files of military operations were made public, those kept about the Battle of May Island remained sealed, and the Royal Navy seemed willing only to acknowledge the most basic facts about it. It wasn't until 1994, 76 years later, that the file was released and the details made public, and in 2002, a memorial was finally constructed in Anstruther Harbor, long after everyone involved had died of old age. Now, every trace of the K-class has either been dismantled or rests on the bottom of the ocean, rusting and decaying, a fate that, to those who served aboard them, would seem only fitting.
Convicts let fire light the way. Deep in the darkness, haunts reside. Silence, silence. No deception comes from the King's command. In the mist, in the distance, in the darkness, in distress. Deep in the mist, silence holds deep under pressure. Life's fragile strand. Surrender. High overhead, life Deep in the darkness, haunts reside. Deep in the mist, silence holds peace. Conviction worn away under waves disregarded, grass float along, ever lost, ever restless, endless dream on, endless ocean. Deep in the ocean, ever rising waves, hush their raging at your word. Deep in the darkness, hugs remain.
Wow. Wow, what a story. What a catastrophe. Yes, guys, that was it for the Battle of May Island down the rabbit hole, made on the Frederick Knudsen YouTube channel and requested by Robert Fridays. The higher echelons of the British Royal Navy, the admirals who were pushing for this K-class, especially Sir John Fisher, they should have been arrested. They should have been stripped of their what am I trying to say? Of their position, yes. They should have been stripped of their position as admirals of the fleet and officers in the British Royal Navy. Really, the K-class and the retrofitted M-class, in total, 124 deaths. 124 deaths. I'm sure there hasn't been any vessel class that has taken so many lives, and not at the hands of their enemies, but at the hands of their own creations. I don't think there's been a catastrophe like this ever. I don't know. I could be wrong. If I am, in the comment section, you guys can correct me. But 124 deaths, due to this class of submarine vessel. Nah. Many people should have taken responsibility for this mess. And I'm not blaming the sailors. That's for sure. I am not blaming the sailors for the type of technology that they were using in this situation. I'm definitely blaming those who are the head of the military, because they have answers to give to the public. But now they're dead. They're also long dead. They're in heaven or hell, wherever people go to after they die. But it's just sad, that all these sailors, their lives, and what happened to them was kept secret, because the British Royal Navy didn't want to be embarrassed, because they didn't want to be investigated. They didn't want to have public scrutiny on them and their actions. So it really is just unfortunate that these officials within the military were not brought before a court of law or before parliament, and for them to explain what is this, what's going on, how is it that so many of our own sailors are dying, and not at the hands of our enemies, but at the hands of our own vessels. Yeah. Someone needed to answer, but it just never materialized. Well, this class of submarine was a mistake. It was a mistake that was pushed by arrogant people, people who did not truly understand the mission parameters of a submarine and what is it meant for. The Germans knew. They should have taken a piece from the German handbook on what a submarine is meant for, and not this fleet doctrine of creating a fleet and having submarines also part of it, and as some sort of screening effort or offensive effort against other submarines. They should have taken lessons from the Germans on what a submarine is meant for, how should it be operated, not centralized and huddled up with all these other vessels. It's supposed to be a lone wolf. It's supposed to be decentralized. It's supposed to be a platform that operates autonomously and not within a battle fleet formation. And the submarines that they built were just too cumbersome and complex and complicated in many aspects of its utilization, and very dangerous, a death trap. That's why I'm saying Sir John Fisher and the other admirals have never actually stepped a foot in those submarines. They've never experienced what the sailors have been experiencing about those vessels. Because if they did, they would have immediately changed their minds on how these submarines have been designed and built, and the type of technology they're using aboard these submarines. They would have changed their minds. You know, they would have went back to the drawing board and try something else. But they never did, because they never stepped foot on these vessels. And I'm sure, the captains or whoever was in command of the K-class submarines, I'm sure they've also voiced their concerns to their superiors about these vessels, that they are just not suited for battle. They're not suited for sailors to operate. It's a death trap. Yeah. Very interesting story. Very, very sad ending to so many sailors' lives, really. And yeah, it's just unfortunate. Like I stated before, it's just unfortunate that the Admiralty was not brought before Parliament or the Portfolio Committee that is tasked with the military, for them to answer questions about these vessels and why were they set sail, and who's ultimately responsible, and who should be court-martialed amongst the Admiralty and jailed. It's really unfortunate. Alright guys, yeah, that's it. This was a very, very interesting story. Thank you, Frederick Knudsen, for making this video. Thank you also to Robert Fridays for this request. Really, this was good. This was really, really good. And remember guys, if you want to check out the original video as well as Frederick Knudsen's YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. If you like my reaction, give it a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos. And I'll see you guys next time. Okay? Bye-bye.